The unexpected journey begins. Admiral Jonathan Matthews stood at the bustling terminal of Chicago O'Hare International Airport, his sharp mind still processing the details of a high-stakes military strategy meeting. Dressed modestly in a crisp white button-down shirt and dark jeans, Jonathan carried himself with a quiet dignity. Despite his towering stature and aura of authority, there was nothing outwardly ostentatious about him. His military accolades, symbols of decades of service, sacrifice, and leadership, were carefully tucked away in his carry-on bag. Today, he was just another traveler in the sea of passengers making their way through the airport. Jonathan had always preferred to travel commercially whenever his schedule allowed. For him, flying with civilians was a grounding experience, a reminder of the people he served and protected. It was a habit born out of humility and a deep sense of duty, a personal philosophy that the rank of admiral was a role he carried, not an identity he flaunted. As he approached the check-in counter, he offered the young attendant a warm smile and handed over his first-class ticket. The seat, 1A, was a rare indulgence for Jonathan, one he had allowed himself after a grueling week of back-to-back meetings that had stretched into late nights. It wasn't about luxury, it was about having a small pocket of comfort amidst a demanding schedule. The attendant, a woman in her early 20s, with a sharp bob and an air of impatience, barely glanced at him. She scanned the ticket with a detached efficiency, her fingers flying over the keyboard. For a moment, everything seemed routine until she hesitated. Her fingers stopped mid-typing, and her brows furrowed ever so slightly. Then, with a perfunctory tone that betrayed no emotion, she handed the ticket back to Jonathan. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Your seat has been reassigned. Unfortunately, we no longer have availability in first class." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his calm demeanor unshaken, but his curiosity piqued. "Reassigned," he repeated, his deep voice carrying both authority and a hint of confusion. "This seat was confirmed days ago. There must be some mistake." The attendant glanced briefly at her computer screen, her expression unreadable. "No mistake, sir. We're fully booked, and your seat has been moved to economy. You'll board with Group 6. For a moment, Jonathan stood still, processing her words. He wasn't one to cause a scene, decades in the Navy had taught him the value of composure and grace under pressure. Yet, something about the situation felt off. The reassignment wasn't just inconvenient, it felt dismissive, even deliberate. The attendant's refusal to meet his eyes, the clipped tone of her voice, the lack of explanation, all of it combined to leave an unsettling impression. "May I ask why my seat was reassigned?" Jonathan inquired, his tone polite but firm. The attendant shrugged, still avoiding his gaze. "It's airline policy. Sometimes adjustments have to be made." Jonathan paused, his sharp mind weighing the options. He could let it go, take the economy seat, and chalk the experience up to bad luck. After all, he wasn't above sitting in economy, it wasn't the seat that defined him. But something in the attendant's demeanor nagged at him. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about principle, about fairness, about standing against the quiet, insidious moments of discrimination that often went unnoticed. "Is there a supervisor I can speak with?" Jonathan asked, his voice calm but unyielding. The attendant sighed, clearly annoyed. "One moment." She turned and walked away, disappearing into a back office. As Jonathan waited, he glanced around the terminal. Travelers hurried past, their faces a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. Nearby, a young boy clung to his mother's hand, his eyes wide with wonder as he pointed at the airplanes taxiing on the runway. Jonathan smiled faintly, reminded of the reasons he had dedicated his life to service. Moments like these, ordinary, beautiful moments of freedom and possibility, were what he fought to protect. After a few minutes, the attendant returned, followed by a man in a suit who introduced himself as the supervisor. "Good afternoon, sir," the supervisor began, his tone professional but not particularly apologetic. "I understand there's an issue with your seat." Jonathan explained the situation succinctly, his words measured and respectful. The supervisor listened, nodding occasionally, but when he spoke, his response was disappointingly similar to the attendant's. "I'm afraid there's nothing we can do at this time. The first-class cabin is overbooked, and your seat has been reassigned. We apologize for the inconvenience." Jonathan studied the supervisor's face, searching for any sign of sincerity. Finding none, he simply nodded. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice steady. As he walked away from the counter, ticket in hand, Jonathan felt a familiar surge of resolve. This wasn't the first time he had encountered bias disguised as bureaucracy, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But he also knew that moments like these weren't about him, they were about setting an example, about standing tall so others wouldn't have to crouch. Taking a deep breath, he made his way to the boarding gate. The sting of injustice lingered, but Jonathan knew that true strength wasn't just about fighting battles, it was about choosing the right time and place to fight them. And as the gate agent called for Group 6, he stepped forward, ready to board the plane, not as an admiral, but as a man determined to carry his dignity wherever he went. The flight of unspoken truths. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as Admiral Jonathan Matthews stepped onto the aircraft, his presence calm and unassuming. He had boarded with Group 6, surrounded by the slow shuffle of passengers dragging their luggage down the narrow aisle. The scene felt almost surreal. Jonathan had spent decades traveling across the globe, sometimes aboard massive aircraft carriers, other times commanding sleek fighter jets, but today, in this economy cabin, it wasn't the seat that weighed on him. It was the quiet, lingering whisper of disrespect that accompanied his reassignment. Jonathan offered polite nods to passengers as he passed, his tall frame forcing him to bend slightly in the low-ceilinged aisle. He carried only a small leather carry-on bag, and his expression, though stoic, radiated a quiet strength that few could ignore. Passengers glanced at him curiously, some sensing the subtle authority in his stride but unable to place it. When Jonathan reached his new seat, 23B, a cramped middle seat near the rear of the plane, he exhaled a quiet breath. The contrast to the first-class seat he'd been denied was jarring. The space was minimal, the armrests already claimed by his seat neighbors, a young man wearing headphones on one side and an older woman clutching a tattered romance novel on the other. "Excuse me," Jonathan said with polite warmth as he slid into the narrow seat. Both passengers offered fleeting, indifferent glances before returning to their distractions. Jonathan tucked his carry-on bag beneath the seat in front of him and leaned back, folding his hands on his lap. His military training had long taught him the art of composure under pressure, and now, even in this moment of quiet disrespect, he wore his dignity like armor. The hum of passengers settling in filled the cabin, babies cried softly, overhead compartments slammed shut, and muffled voices exchanged hurried farewells over cell phones. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. He thought back to his days as a young officer, freshly commissioned and full of dreams, navigating a world that often judged his abilities before his actions. Back then, his rank had been earned through sweat, sacrifice, and endless nights of study, training, and leadership. Now, as one of the highest-ranking officers in the Navy, he carried with him not just personal pride but the weight of those who had come before him, men and women who had fought for their place at the table. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the presence of someone lingering in the aisle. Jonathan opened his eyes to see a tall man with neatly combed gray hair and piercing blue eyes, the pilot, moving down the cabin. The pilot wore his white uniform with polished epaulettes and 4 gold stripes adorning his sleeves. He moved with confidence, and as he glanced from seat to seat, he exuded an air of calm authority. Jonathan frowned slightly, watching the pilot with curiosity. It was unusual for a captain to leave the cockpit during pre-flight preparations. Then, to Jonathan's mild surprise, the pilot's eyes landed on him. "Sir, could I speak with you for a moment?" the pilot asked, his tone polite but firm. Jonathan hesitated. Around him, passengers turned their heads curiously. The young man to his right lowered his headphones, clearly intrigued, and a child 2 rows up peeked over the seatback with wide eyes. Jonathan rose smoothly, offering a polite nod. "Of course." The pilot led him toward the front of the plane, back through the economy cabin. The murmur of passengers followed them as heads turned to watch, eyes filled with curiosity and hushed speculation. When they reached the galley just behind the first-class section, the pilot turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Sir, I don't mean to intrude," the pilot began, his voice quieter now. "But I believe there's been some sort of mistake." "Are you Admiral Jonathan Matthews?" Jonathan blinked in surprise, but quickly nodded. "Yes, I am." The pilot straightened instinctively, his posture shifting to a stance of respect and professionalism. "Admiral, it's an honor to have you aboard. I don't know how this happened, but I want to personally apologize for the inconvenience regarding your seat." Jonathan regarded the pilot carefully. There was no pretense in the man's tone, just genuine surprise and respect. He had encountered officers like this before, men and women who recognized rank not as a symbol of superiority, but as a reflection of responsibility and sacrifice. "It's no trouble," Jonathan replied, his tone calm. "I was content to sit where I was assigned." The pilot shook his head firmly. "With all due respect, sir, it shouldn't have come to this. I'd like to escort you back to first class. We'll make sure everything is handled properly." Jonathan paused, considering the offer. Part of him wanted to decline, to remain in economy, to prove a point about humility and dignity. But he also understood something deeper. Accepting this gesture wasn't just about reclaiming a seat, it was about confronting an unspoken wrong. It wasn't vanity that drove his decision, it was the knowledge that sometimes, standing tall in the face of injustice required accepting respect when it was deserved. "I appreciate that, Captain," Jonathan said finally. The pilot led him back through the economy section, where passengers now watched the scene unfold with wide eyes and curious whispers. The cabin seemed to buzz with energy, questions left unspoken but shared in glances. Jonathan walked tall, his presence commanding respect without a single word. For many passengers, it was clear that the man they had dismissed as just another traveler was someone far greater. When they reached the first-class cabin, the flight attendant at the front blanched slightly, clearly flustered. The pilot addressed her directly, his tone sharp. "This gentleman was reassigned to the wrong seat. Please ensure he's properly accommodated." "Yes, Captain," she stammered, stepping aside hurriedly. Jonathan sank into seat 1A, the same seat he had been denied earlier. The contrast from economy was stark, plush leather, ample legroom, and a level of comfort designed to ease even the longest of flights. But Jonathan hardly noticed. He was too aware of the silence that now permeated the cabin, the weight of unspoken realizations that hung in the air. The pilot offered him one last nod. "Enjoy the flight, Admiral. It's an honor to have you aboard." "Thank you, Captain," Jonathan replied warmly. As the pilot returned to the cockpit, Jonathan leaned back in his seat, hands resting on the armrests. His thoughts drifted to the quiet moments of bias he had faced over the years, moments that others may have overlooked, but that he could never forget. Moments like these weren't about anger, they were about understanding the power of presence, of reminding the world that dignity could not be diminished. The flight attendant approached with a glass of water. "Is there anything I can get for you, sir?" Jonathan offered her a small smile. "I'm fine, thank you." As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Jonathan gazed out the window, watching the city blur past. Somewhere in the economy section, passengers were likely still whispering, still wondering what had happened. And maybe that was the point. Sometimes, the greatest lessons weren't taught through words, but through moments of quiet strength and dignity. The journey within the journey. As the airplane ascended into the clouds, Admiral Jonathan Matthews stared quietly out the window. The bustling airport and the chaos of boarding were now distant memories, replaced by the soft hum of the engines and the vast expanse of blue sky stretching out beyond the horizon. To anyone watching, Jonathan was simply another passenger, a man enjoying the view. But within him, a silent storm brewed. It wasn't the seat or even the disrespectful encounter at the check-in counter that occupied his thoughts. No, it was the way such experiences lingered, the way they chipped away at the foundation of dignity, the way they reminded him that even after years of dedicated service and sacrifice, there were still moments when the world refused to see him for who he was. As the flight attendant quietly moved through the first-class cabin, serving drinks and snacks, Jonathan found himself retreating into memory, a mental journey to a time long before the titles, the accolades, or the 4 stars on his shoulders. The path that had led him to this moment had been anything but easy. The boy from Charleston. Jonathan Matthews was born in Charleston, South Carolina, the youngest of 4 children in a small, tight-knit family. His father, Joseph Matthews, had worked 2 jobs, one as a dock worker at the port and the other as a janitor at the local high school. His mother, Clara, worked as a seamstress, carefully patching up worn-out clothes for neighborhood families. Though life was hard, their home was rich with love and discipline. From a young age, Jonathan had been different. Where other kids saw limits, he saw possibilities. His mother would often tell the story of how, at the age of 7, he had stood on the edge of Charleston Harbor, staring out at a Navy destroyer docked in the distance. One day, he'd said, pointing to the massive ship, "I'm going to be the captain of a ship like that." "You can be anything you want to be," his mother had told him. "But you'll have to work for it. The world won't hand it to you." Jonathan's childhood was marked by challenges that tested both his patience and his resolve. At school, he was often underestimated, dismissed as another kid from the poor side of town. Teachers overlooked his sharp mind, classmates mocked his hand-me-down clothes. But Jonathan never let it break him. Each insult, each moment of exclusion, became fuel for his ambition. He devoured books, biographies of historical leaders, textbooks on science, and novels that transported him to new worlds. His father, despite his exhaustion, taught Jonathan the value of hard work. "If you want respect," Joseph would say, his calloused hands resting on Jonathan's shoulder, "you've got to earn it, boy. No shortcuts." Jonathan carried those words like scripture. The decision that changed everything. By the time he was a teenager, Jonathan's world was full of choices, some good, others dangerous. Charleston streets were no stranger to violence and despair, and Jonathan saw friends lose themselves to gangs, drugs, and hopelessness. But he refused to follow that path. Instead, he threw himself into his studies and his love of the sea. Every afternoon after school, he would bike down to the docks, watching the ships come and go. He imagined the lives of the sailors aboard, men who traveled the world, who saw places he could only dream of. One fateful summer, at the age of 17, Jonathan met Captain Henry Roth, a Navy officer who had returned home to Charleston to visit his family. The encounter happened by accident. Jonathan had been helping his father clean the floors of a community center where Roth was giving a speech. Jonathan had lingered in the back of the room, entranced by the captain's stories of leadership, travel, and service. When the speech ended, Jonathan gathered the courage to approach him. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but nervous, "how do you become someone like you?" Captain Roth had smiled, impressed by the boy's boldness. "It starts with discipline," he said. "And it requires vision. If you want to lead, you have to first learn to follow. Have you considered the Naval Academy?" Jonathan hadn't. The idea of someone like him, a poor black boy from Charleston, attending a prestigious institution like the United States Naval Academy, seemed almost laughable. But Captain Roth's words planted a seed that would soon take root. Over the next year, Jonathan worked harder than ever before. He studied late into the night, worked weekends to save money for applications, and pushed himself beyond every limit he thought he had. When he finally received his acceptance letter to the Naval Academy, he fell to his knees, clutching the paper in his hands as tears streamed down his face. The Academy, a trial by fire. The Naval Academy was everything Jonathan had hoped for, and more. It was rigorous, demanding, and relentless. He was surrounded by the best and brightest from across the country, many of whom came from wealth, privilege, and military legacies. Jonathan, by contrast, arrived with nothing but his ambition and the unwavering support of his family. He faced hurdles that tested not only his intelligence, but his resolve. There were whispered remarks about his background, subtle slights disguised as jokes, and moments when instructors questioned whether he belonged there. Jonathan endured it all with a quiet strength, refusing to let prejudice define him. He rose to every challenge, mastering academics, physical training, and leadership exercises with an unyielding determination. His peers soon learned that Jonathan was no ordinary cadet. He was calm under pressure, quick to analyze problems, and fiercely protective of his fellow sailors. By the time he graduated, Jonathan had earned not only the respect of his classmates, but also their admiration. He was named class leader, a distinction few could claim. But the real test lay ahead. Jonathan entered the Navy during a time when opportunities for black officers were still limited, and he knew that he would need to work twice as hard to prove himself. And he did. With each deployment, each command, and each challenge, Jonathan climbed the ranks, earning medals, accolades, and the unwavering loyalty of those who served under him. His rise was not without sacrifice. He spent months at sea, missed birthdays, holidays, and family milestones. Yet, through it all, Jonathan remained steadfast, guided by the same vision he'd had as a boy on the docks of Charleston. Back to the present. The plane continued its smooth climb, the clouds outside blending into soft whites and blues. Jonathan blinked, his mind returning to the present as the flight attendant approached again with a tray of drinks. He accepted a glass of water, offering her a polite smile. "Is there something else I can get you, sir?" she asked. Jonathan shook his head. "No, thank you." As he sat back in his seat, Jonathan reflected on how far he had come. The encounter at the check-in counter, though brief, was a reminder of the struggles he had faced his entire life. Prejudice didn't always arrive with a shout, sometimes it crept in quietly, through averted gazes, unspoken assumptions, and polite dismissals. But Jonathan had learned long ago that dignity could not be taken. It could not be assigned by a seat number or stripped away by someone else's ignorance. It was something you carried with you, no matter where life placed you. And as the plane cruised higher into the sky, Jonathan Matthews knew this journey, like every other in his life, was about far more than just a seat. A lesson in the skies. The steady hum of the engines provided a background rhythm as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet. Admiral Jonathan Matthews sat in seat 1A, his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of clouds stretching across the horizon. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional clink of glasses and the muted whispers of conversation. For most passengers, it was just another routine flight. But for Jonathan, the undercurrent of the earlier events lingered, a quiet reminder that respect could never be demanded but must always be earned. Jonathan had no intention of dwelling on what had happened. Life had taught him that anger, especially the quiet, smoldering kind, was a burden best laid down. Yet, he couldn't shake the nagging question that had taken root in his mind. Why had the check-in attendant chosen to reassign him? Was it simply a matter of overbooking? Or was there something more insidious hidden beneath her disinterested demeanor? As Jonathan sat and thought, a quiet commotion broke the stillness of the first-class cabin. A disruption in first class. It began with a man 2 rows behind Jonathan, an impeccably dressed gentleman with slicked-back hair and an air of entitlement that hung around him like cologne. He was bickering with the flight attendant, his voice low but sharp, the kind of tone that sent chills down the spine of anyone who'd been on the receiving end of it. "I don't understand," the man was saying, his words clipped. "I specifically requested this seat. You can't just move me." The flight attendant, a young woman who clearly wasn't prepared for the confrontation, tried her best to maintain her composure. "Sir, we had to accommodate another passenger. I assure you the seat you've been reassigned to is still." "I don't care where you've reassigned me," the man cut her off. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Jonathan turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of the man's red face as he waved his hand dramatically. He'd seen people like this before, men so convinced of their own importance that they believed the world should bend to their every whim. Years of experience had taught Jonathan how to read people quickly, and this man's behavior set his instincts on edge. Sir, the flight attendant said again, her voice shaking ever so slightly, I'll need you to calm down. Calm down? The man's voice rose, drawing attention from other passengers. Do you even know who I work for? I have half a mind to. Enough. The word wasn't shouted, but it landed like a gavel in a courtroom. It had come from Jonathan, whose voice, though calm, carried the weight of authority that only decades of leadership could create. All heads turned toward him as he rose slowly from his seat. The man blinked, stunned into silence by the unexpected interruption. Jonathan stepped into the aisle, his presence commanding without being aggressive. He stood tall, his gaze level and steady as he addressed the man. She's doing her job, Jonathan said firmly, nodding toward the flight attendant, who looked simultaneously relieved and uncertain. And I suggest you let her do it without making it harder. The man's mouth opened and closed as if searching for a response. For the first time in their brief exchange, Jonathan saw something flicker in the man's eyes, recognition. He didn't know Jonathan personally, of course, but something about Jonathan's presence told him that he wasn't a man to challenge. And who are you supposed to be? The man finally said, though his voice had lost some of its bite. Jonathan smiled faintly, his tone calm but pointed. Just someone who knows how to treat people with respect. The cabin fell silent. For a moment, the tension hung thick in the air as the entitled man seemed to weigh his options. Then, with a reluctant huff, he dropped back into his seat, crossing his arms like a child denied a toy. The flight attendant turned to Jonathan with an appreciative glance, her shoulders visibly relaxing. Thank you, sir, she said softly. Jonathan offered her a polite nod before returning to his seat. As he sat down, he noticed the subtle ripple of reaction from the other passengers, some exchanged approving glances, others whispered quietly. It wasn't the first time Jonathan had stepped into a moment like that, and it likely wouldn't be the last. What mattered most to him was the principle of it, dignity should never be conditional. The power of unspoken words. As the plane continued its journey, the tension in the cabin dissipated, replaced once again by the quiet normalcy of air travel. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, his thoughts returning to the countless moments like these he'd faced throughout his career, moments where someone's assumptions, prejudices, or ignorance had forced him to step forward, not for himself but for the principle of what was right. Jonathan thought back to his time as a young officer, fresh out of the Naval Academy, assigned to his first command. Back then, the Navy had still been grappling with the slow march toward inclusion. Many of his fellow officers had been skeptical of him, not because of his skills, but because of the color of his skin. He had been challenged at every turn, forced to prove himself time and time again. He remembered one particular night at sea, when a sudden storm had engulfed their ship. Waves crashed violently against the hull, and chaos threatened to unravel the crew's cohesion. Jonathan, then a junior officer, had been the first to step up. He barked orders with precision, coordinating the efforts to steady the ship and ensure the safety of the crew. When the storm passed, an older officer, one who had previously doubted him, approached and said, "You've earned my respect tonight, Lieutenant Matthews." Jonathan had never forgotten that moment. It wasn't the officer's words that mattered most, it was what they represented. True respect couldn't be given, it had to be earned, and earning it often required walking through storms far greater than the physical one he had faced that night. Back to the present. As the hours ticked by, Jonathan sat quietly in seat 1A, reflecting on all these moments, the challenges, the triumphs, and the unspoken battles that shaped the man he was today. He glanced out the window at the clouds once more, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. It wasn't the events of the day that mattered most, it was how he chose to respond to them. Just then, the flight attendant returned, a small tray in her hands. "Sir," she said quietly, "the captain asked me to bring you this." She placed a handwritten note in front of him. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, unfolding the slip of paper. "Admiral Matthews? It's an honor to have you aboard. Your service is appreciated more than words can say. Thank you for being the kind of leader the world needs." Jonathan's lips curled into a small smile. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket, a quiet reminder that sometimes, the greatest impact wasn't made through speeches or medals but through moments of quiet strength. As the plane sailed steadily toward its destination, Jonathan leaned back in his seat, feeling a sense of peace. He had long learned that dignity was not about the seat you occupied but the way you carried yourself. And as long as he walked this earth, Jonathan Matthews would carry his dignity as high as the stars he wore. The landing and the lasting impression. As the airplane descended, the cabin filled with the soft hum of passengers preparing for arrival. The lights dimmed slightly, and the flight attendants moved efficiently, securing trays and reminding everyone to fasten their seatbelts. Admiral Jonathan Matthews sat quietly in seat 1A, his posture relaxed, but his thoughts focused. Outside the window, the city below came into view, an endless tapestry of streets, buildings, and lives interwoven like threads in a grand story. Jonathan felt the familiar pull of the descent in his stomach, but this flight had been far from ordinary. From the moment his seat had been reassigned at check-in, the day had unfolded like a subtle lesson, a reminder of the quiet, invisible challenges he had faced his entire life and the strength it took to rise above them. But Jonathan wasn't dwelling on the past. Instead, he was thinking of the present, and of the future. Because leadership, he knew, wasn't about titles, uniforms, or medals. It was about showing up in the moments that mattered and leaving behind something meaningful, no matter how small. The captain's acknowledgement. As the plane touched down smoothly on the tarmac, a ripple of relief passed through the cabin. Passengers unclipped their belts, gathered their belongings, and murmured about connections and luggage. Jonathan remained seated, watching calmly as the first-class passengers filed past him. Just as he reached for his carry-on bag beneath the seat, a voice crackled through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Washington, D.C. On behalf of the crew, we'd like to extend a special acknowledgement to one of our passengers today. Admiral Jonathan Matthews, United States Navy, is on board with us, and we'd like to thank him for his decades of service to our country. Admiral, it's an honor to have you." The message hung in the air, reverberating across the cabin like a gentle wave. Heads turned, passengers paused mid-movement, their gazes shifting towards seat 1A. Some eyes widened in surprise, others softened with admiration. The murmurs of confusion that had once surrounded Jonathan's presence earlier in the flight were replaced with an audible hum of respect. Jonathan nodded politely at the nearest flight attendant, who offered him a small, grateful smile. From the corner of his eye, Jonathan noticed the man from earlier. The entitled passenger who had berated the flight attendant. His face had gone pale, his gaze flickering nervously between Jonathan and his carry-on bag. Recognition and embarrassment played across his features like conflicting tides. Jonathan rose to his full height, his presence commanding but not intimidating. As he stepped into the aisle, there was no smugness in his demeanor, no satisfaction at the man's discomfort. Instead, Jonathan carried himself with the same quiet grace that had defined him his entire life. As Jonathan passed the man's row, the man opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Jonathan paused briefly, locking eyes with him. What the man saw in Jonathan's gaze was not anger, nor was it pity. It was something far deeper, forgiveness mixed with an unspoken challenge. Be better. Do better. Jonathan gave the slightest of nods, then continued down the aisle. The terminal, a moment of reflection. When Jonathan exited the jet bridge and stepped into the terminal, he was met with the familiar chaos of an airport. The hum of conversations, the rolling of luggage wheels, and the cries of children blended into an almost musical background. Jonathan walked calmly, carrying his bag over one shoulder. He had no entourage, no display of importance, just a quiet dignity that turned heads wherever he went. Near the gate, the pilot was waiting for him. The captain had removed his hat, tucking it respectfully under his arm as Jonathan approached. "Admiral," the pilot said, his voice steady but reverent. "I want to apologize again for earlier. I don't know what happened at check-in, but it shouldn't have." Jonathan extended his hand, and the pilot took it firmly. "No need to apologize, Captain," Jonathan said. "I've faced bigger battles in my day." The pilot smiled faintly, his respect evident. "We're lucky to have men like you serving our country." Jonathan offered a small, humble nod. "Thank you. And thank you for your professionalism." As they released their handshake, Jonathan turned to leave, but not before noticing the check-in attendant from earlier, standing near the counter. She was talking to a colleague, her gaze flickering nervously toward him. Jonathan walked straight toward her, his footsteps measured and purposeful. The woman's face paled slightly as he approached, clearly unsure of what to expect. "Sir," she began, her voice small, I'm sorry for..." Jonathan held up a hand, stopping her gently. "No need," he said calmly, his tone kind but firm. "Mistakes happen. What matters is what we learn from them." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and for a moment, Jonathan thought he saw genuine remorse in her eyes. Without waiting for a response, he offered her a polite nod and continued walking. He didn't need an apology. What mattered most was planting a seed, showing her, and anyone who had witnessed the events of the day, that integrity and dignity could never be dismissed. Leaving a legacy. As Jonathan stepped out into the busy street beyond the terminal, the cool air greeted him like an old friend. The city of Washington, D.C., stood tall around him, monuments to leadership and sacrifice at every turn. Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Moments like the one he had experienced today were reminders of why he had spent his life serving a cause greater than himself. It wasn't about recognition or respect, it was about changing the conversation. About confronting ignorance not with anger but with poise. About teaching people, sometimes silently, that the content of one's character would always matter more than appearances. In his decades of service, Jonathan Matthews had commanded fleets, coordinated rescue missions, and stood in war rooms where the fate of nations was decided. Yet it was moments like these, simple, human moments, that often left the greatest mark. Jonathan adjusted his bag on his shoulder and began walking down the busy sidewalk. He knew his work wasn't done, not yet. There were still minds to change, battles to fight, and lessons to teach. And whether in the corridors of the Pentagon, the streets of Charleston, or the cramped economy seats of an airplane, Admiral Jonathan Matthews would continue to carry himself with the quiet strength of a man who had long ago learned this truth. Dignity cannot be given or taken. It is earned. It is carried. And it is unshakable. As he disappeared into the flow of people, Jonathan left behind no fanfare, no applause, only a lingering impression, a whisper of respect that would stay with those who had crossed his path. Somewhere, passengers from Flight 451 would tell the story of the day they unknowingly shared a plane with a hero. And perhaps, in their retelling, they would remember the most important lesson of all. True power lies not in what the world sees, but in how you choose to see yourself.